Tokyo, August 15th, 1945. The air was heavy, the sun muted by a haze of dust, and the city's broken streets lay still. Only one sound carried across the ruins, the trembling voice of Emperor Hirohito on radios crackling in homes, shelters, and alleyways. The war has ended. Then silence. Men and women bowed their heads. Some wept openly, others stared at the ground in disbelief. Mothers clutched their children as if holding back the tide of history itself. The unthinkable had been spoken aloud. Japan had surrendered. That broadcast transformed Tokyo in an instant. In neighborhoods flattened by firebombing, families huddled together, listening for each strained word. The numbers were staggering. Over 330,000 civilians had already been made homeless by the raids, and nearly every district bore scars of flame. But the news of surrender struck deeper than fire. It was not just buildings reduced to ash. It was the collapse of a nation's pride. People exchanged glances, but no one dared speak. The only question in every mind was the same. What will the Americans do to us now? For years, propaganda had painted the enemy as ruthless beasts who showed no mercy. In diaries and whispered conversations, one line returned again and again. We thought Americans would come with whips. That expectation clung to every shadow, feeding fear as families pressed closer to their radios. And yet, amid the grief, a fragile thought surfaced. Perhaps this meant no more bombs, no more air raid sirens in the night. Perhaps the children would live to see another morning. The mood was a strange mixture of despair and faint relief. On one street, a shopkeeper quietly removed his military armband. In another, a young boy traced his finger through ash on a wall as if writing the word peace. But no one knew what form that peace would take. The empire had fallen, and now the victors would arrive to claim the streets of Tokyo. And when they did, the sight that greeted civilians was not whips or chains, but convoys of Allied soldiers rumbling into the capital, a moment that would ignite an entirely new shock. 2 days after the Emperor's broadcast, Tokyo trembled again, not from bombs, but from engines. The first Allied convoys rolled into the ruined capital, their movement steady, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Jeeps carried fluttering flags, sunlight bouncing off polished insignia. Trucks groaned under the weight of supplies, and rows of soldiers marched, their boots pounding broken pavement in a rhythm unlike anything the city had heard before. Dust swirled in the late summer air, rising into the shattered frames of homes where civilians hid, watching with wide eyes. Official reports suggest nearly 150,000 American troops were funneled into the initial phase of occupation. To survivors who had expected execution or enslavement, the scale alone was overwhelming. Convoys stretched street after street, their lines unbroken. Women pressed children to their sides, shielding them from view, while old men bowed their heads in shame. Every rifle, bayonet, and helmet gleamed like a symbol of absolute dominance. The sound of engines replaced the wail of air raid sirens, and with each passing vehicle, the reality grew heavier. Tokyo belonged to someone else now. And yet, what people saw jarred against the monsters they had been told to expect. The soldiers' movements were organized, their discipline strict, but they did not loot or strike the civilians who lined the ruins. Painted mascots and cartoon symbols adorned some vehicles, absurd against a city still smoldering. To many, it felt surreal. These were the so-called devils of propaganda? A man later recalled, their helmets looked larger than life. It wasn't only steel, he described. It was confidence, abundance, and a sense of invincibility that weighed more than any weapon. Still, the fear lingered. Civilians held their breath, waiting for cruelty to erupt at any second. Mothers whispered prayers, children buried their faces in sleeves. But then came the detail no one had prepared them for. In the back of certain trucks and staff vehicles, small figures sat upright, laughing, pointing, chattering. They were not soldiers at all, but American children. Sons and daughters of officers, dependents of the very men who had brought Japan to its knees. The civilians blinked, confused. In a city where their own children had starved on rations of 1,400 calories a day, here were conquerors' children, clean, healthy, and smiling. The sight unsettled them even more than rifles. And soon those children's laughter would echo in the most solemn of moments. The convoys did not just bring soldiers. As days passed, Tokyo civilians noticed something even stranger. The conquerors had brought their families. Alongside jeeps bristling with rifles and trucks piled high with supplies, smaller groups appeared. Women in neat dresses, and children skipping behind their fathers in pressed uniforms. To Japanese eyes still fixed on ruins, the sight felt unreal, as if the capital had become stage scenery for a different world altogether. Reports indicate that hundreds of dependents arrived during the early months of the occupation, a fact carefully managed by U.S. command to normalize their presence. But for ordinary Japanese civilians who had endured years of rationing, bombings, and grief, the effect was shocking. On streets where children carried empty rice bowls, American sons and daughters tossed baseballs, tugged at their mothers' skirts, or simply laughed out loud. Their voices cut through the silence of mourning like sparks against ash. Eyewitnesses described the moment with disbelief. One woman, standing in the shadow of a burned-out tram car, whispered, "How could they laugh here, where our sons had died?" To her, the laughter was not innocent. It was a reminder of loss, of futures erased. Each giggle collided with the memory of boys shipped to Manchuria, of brothers lost at sea, or fathers buried in ash-filled urns. The contrast was unbearable. And yet, it was impossible to look away. Civilians lined the sidewalks as occupation staff moved into government buildings and barracks. Soldiers carried crates of supplies, while children darted between their legs, giggling at the strangeness of rubble, tugging at stray pieces of twisted steel as if they were toys. For families who had feared bayonets, this new reality brought something more complicated: humiliation wrapped in astonishment. The conquerors had arrived not just to control Tokyo, but to live in it, with their loved ones unharmed, untouched by war. The symbolism was powerful. The war had consumed Japan's youth, while across the ocean, America's children had remained untouched, shielded by oceans and industrial might. Now they were here, in the heart of the defeated empire, their laughter rising above the ruins like a second declaration of victory. Civilians tried to reconcile the noise. Was it cruelty, or simply the sound of a world they no longer belonged to? That question deepened when the same children appeared at moments that demanded solemnity, moments when Japan's surrender was being formalized before the eyes of its people. September 2, 1945. Tokyo was still scarred and smoldering, but all eyes turned toward Tokyo Bay, where the Japanese surrender was formally signed aboard the USS Missouri. Radios carried the ceremony into the city, and civilians gathered silently around crackling speakers. Flags were lowered, armbands removed, and the empire's last symbols slipped into history. It was meant to be a moment of solemnity, heavy with finality. Yet across some of the occupied districts, another sound intruded, the laughter of American children. Eyewitnesses recalled standing on streets where military police supervised crowds, ensuring order, while Japanese civilians watched in stillness. And then, from the steps of Allied offices or the backs of jeeps, came a sudden burst of giggling. Children amused by the spectacle, by uniforms too big for them, by flags coming down like props in a play. For a people in mourning, that sound felt like a knife twisting. The contrast was unbearable. Families who had lost sons to Guadalcanal or Iwo Jima now heard the conqueror's children laughing as their own flag was folded away. One man later remembered, "Our grief was their casual amusement." It was not that the children mocked intentionally. How could they know? Yet to Japanese ears, each giggle echoed louder than speeches on the radio. Numbers added weight to the moment. More than 2.3 million Japanese soldiers had died in the war, while countless families in Tokyo faced daily rations of less than 1,400 calories. Hunger and despair defined their existence. Against that backdrop, the sight of well-fed children chuckling at solemn ceremonies seemed surreal. It was as if the conquerors had brought an entirely different world with them, a world immune to the ruins surrounding Tokyo. The symbolism was devastating. Where Japan's youth had been sacrificed, America's youth now stood laughing on the very soil of surrender. Civilians felt stripped not only of empire, but of dignity. The sound became unforgettable, a reminder that even in moments of ceremony, defeat was not quiet. It was amplified by innocence that did not belong to them. And as the echo of that laughter spread through Tokyo's broken streets, civilians wrestled with a new torment: how to reconcile their shattered pride with the carefree voices of children. The answer would come in the days that followed, as shock transformed into something even more painful: cognitive dissonance that touched every corner of Japanese life. For civilians in Tokyo, the surrender was final. Yet the sight of conquerors' children laughing in the ruins created a torment that words struggled to hold. Defeat was absolute. Flags lowered, armies dissolved. Yet here were small, carefree figures skipping in the rubble, proof that the victor's world had remained untouched. The contrast tore at survivors' minds. Mothers, holding ration bags with barely enough rice to feed a child for a day, watched in silence as American youngsters laughed at nothing more than dust swirling in the air. The numbers painted the cruelty of the gap. By late 1945, official rations in Tokyo often dropped to 1,400 calories per day, far below survival needs. Malnutrition spread quickly. Reports noted black market lines of children begging for scraps or trading family heirlooms for a handful of barley. Against that backdrop, the sound of foreign children playing in pressed clothes, with faces full of color, felt like mockery without intent. One eyewitness wrote later, "We starved, their children played." It was not anger at the children themselves, but at the imbalance made visible in a single scene. Japan's families had sacrificed sons in China, Burma, the Pacific Islands, futures extinguished by war. America, shielded by oceans and powered by industry, had preserved its next generation so completely that it could bring them into a defeated capital as if for a family posting abroad. Psychologists would later call this cognitive dissonance, the collision of two truths that could not exist in the same space. For the Japanese, it was the realization that while they mourned millions dead, the enemy lived with such abundance that children could giggle at their surrender. No amount of propaganda could prepare minds for that contradiction. Yet the paradox cut deeper. Some mothers whispered that laughter meant safety, that if conquerors brought children, then massacres were unlikely. Others felt humiliation so raw they turned away, unable to bear the sound. In both reactions, the truth was undeniable. America's presence was more than military, it was cultural, and it was already reshaping how defeat felt in daily life. This painful contrast would only sharpen in the weeks ahead, when convoys of food, gum, and chocolate rolled into Tokyo, physical proof of an industrial might that dwarfed anything Japan had ever imagined. The shock of laughter was soon followed by something even more overwhelming: abundance on wheels. Within weeks of the surrender, Allied convoys pushed deeper into Tokyo, their trucks stacked high with boxes stamped U.S. Army. Canvas covers flapped as crates of canned food, powdered milk, and chewing gum rolled through streets where families had survived on watery rice gruel. Civilians stared in disbelief as soldiers tossed ration tins casually, the metallic clatter echoing in neighborhoods where every grain of barley had been counted. Statistics tell the scale. In the first year of occupation alone, more than 4.5 million tons of supplies were shipped into Japan. It was a river of goods, flour, sugar, medicine, cigarettes, that seemed impossible to a nation whose transport system lay shattered and whose fields had yielded only hunger. While Japanese children lined up with ration cards, American sons chewed gum until it lost flavor, then asked for more. The disparity was not just visible, it was humiliating. Eyewitnesses remembered the bitterness. One woman later recalled, "They had more sweets than we had rice." To the civilian mind, the crates symbolized more than food. They embodied the truth that had won the war: industry, logistics, and production on a scale Japan could never match. Each Hershey bar and each tin of Spam was a quiet weapon, proof that America's factories had defeated the empire as surely as its soldiers had. Children became the most unsettling messengers of this abundance. Japanese mothers, clutching ration bags of dried yams, watched in silence as American children popped gum, their jaws moving in cheerful rhythm. A simple act became a taunt, even if unintentional. To civilians, it was as though the conqueror's children mocked scarcity itself, living proof that the war had been decided long before the final bomb fell. Yet within the bitterness, another realization took root. If America had so much that it could bring families, feed its soldiers luxuriously, and even supply candy to children, then Japan had no chance of rising against such power. The laughter that once wounded pride now fused with the sight of endless crates, creating a new form of surrender, cultural, not military. And this surrender carried its own sting, because it was witnessed every single day. That sting deepened as civilians began to see the conqueror's children not merely as strangers, but as symbols of a future Japan feared it had lost. For many civilians in Tokyo, the presence of American children soon became more than a curiosity. It became a haunting symbol. Their laughter was not just sound, it was evidence. Evidence that America had won more than the war. They had preserved what Japan had lost, the future. As Japanese families mourned sons who would never return, they saw enemy children running through rubble as if it were a playground. The contrast burned into memory. Whispers spread through crowds. "They still have generations untouched by war," one woman murmured as she watched a boy toss a ball beside a military truck. In her mind, it was undeniable. While Japan's youth had been consumed by battlefields and firebombs, America's youth had been protected by oceans, insulated by an industrial system that supplied both guns and candy. It was not only a military defeat, it was a generational one. The statistics reinforced that feeling. Japan's 66 major cities had been bombed, many reduced to ash, while the American mainland remained virtually untouched by enemy attacks. Tokyo civilians knew this instinctively, staring at ruins around them while hearing stories of abundance across the Pacific. Each child who skipped through their streets became proof of that imbalance. Eyewitnesses spoke in tones of humiliation. One man later said, "Their innocence mocked our ruins." It was not the fault of the children, but the symbolism was inescapable. Every laugh was a reminder of Japan's collapsed empire. Every candy wrapper fluttering on the ground seemed to say, the victors could protect even their most vulnerable, while the defeated could not. Mothers felt it most sharply. They saw their own children hollow-cheeked, ration bags clutched like lifelines, while across the street, American children were healthy, carefree, full of life. For civilians, the sight was unbearable and magnetic all at once, a mirror of what they had lost and a glimpse of what might never return. But symbols had power beyond humiliation. Soon people began recalling another comparison, one that cut deep. How Japanese soldiers captured abroad had been treated in Allied hands. If American children lived this freely, what had their captured fathers experienced overseas? That question would ignite a new layer of culture shock. As the occupation settled in, Another layer of humiliation crept into Tokyo's conversations. Whispers about how Japanese prisoners had been treated overseas. Civilians who had braced for brutality began to hear startling rumors. "Our men in America played baseball," someone said quietly in a market line. Another voice added, "They ate meat every week." In a city surviving on thin rations and ash, these stories felt implausible, and yet they spread, passed from family to family, amplifying the shock already triggered by the sight of American children. The statistics were staggering. More than 425,000 Axis prisoners, German, Italian, and Japanese, had been held in camps across the United States. Unlike the skeletal figures returning from Japanese camps in Asia, many of these men had come back healthy, even heavier than when captured. Reports described organized sports, libraries, and regular meals of bread, vegetables, and meat. For Japanese civilians staring into half-empty bowls, the contrast was cruel. One man, whose brother had been captured in the Philippines, later muttered bitterly, "Our soldiers lived like kings in enemy land." It was an exaggeration, but it captured the wound. Civilians had been told their warriors would die with honor, starving or fighting to the last breath. Instead, the truth was that some had survived the war in far better conditions than their families endured at home. This realization clashed directly with propaganda that had promised Americans would slaughter prisoners and enslave civilians. The very existence of healthy repatriated POWs became another shockwave of disbelief. Civilians now understood that the conquerors not only had more food, more trucks, and more children, they even treated enemy soldiers with a degree of respect denied by their own officers. For mothers staring at laughing American children, the humiliation deepened. It was as if mercy had been extended everywhere, except to them. They had buried sons, rationed rice to starvation levels, and endured nightly bombings, only to learn that their captured soldiers had eaten better than their own families. The sound of foreign laughter in Tokyo's streets now carried double weight. It was not only the symbol of victory, but of an inversion of everything Japanese civilians had believed about war. And that weight soon translated into something darker, the crushing sense of humiliation that saturated daily life. By autumn of 1945, humiliation had seeped into every corner of Tokyo. It wasn't just the ruins, the ration lines, or the surrender ceremonies. It was the daily sight of conquerors' children laughing in the streets. For men who had once bowed before the emperor's portrait and pledged their lives to the empire, that laughter cut deeper than defeat on the battlefield. It was constant, casual, and utterly unbothered by the grief surrounding it. Elders gathered near shrines reduced to rubble, lowering their heads as American children tossed balls between jeeps or skipped across cracked pavements. Each playful shout echoed against walls blackened by firebombs. To civilians, the sound was unbearable, a reminder of what had been lost and what could never return. Japan's next generation had been buried in Burma, on Saipan, at Iwo Jima. Yet America's next generation was here, whole, alive and carefree. The numbers spoke louder than words. By war's end, an estimated 2.3 million Japanese soldiers were dead. Behind each number lay a household mourning a son, a father, or a brother. Entire villages had lost nearly every young man. Now those same families looked across ruined streets and saw conquerors' children laughing where their own would never stand again. A diary entry from the time summed up the bitterness. We gave sons, they gave laughter. It was not hatred of the children, but the unbearable contrast of sacrifice versus survival. Japanese pride, already shattered by surrender, crumbled further under the weight of such scenes. Humiliation was not delivered by whips or bayonets. It arrived in the innocent laughter of children who had no idea of the pain around them. And yet, not all responses were the same. Some elders, watching silently, whispered that perhaps this laughter was also a strange kind of mercy. If conquerors brought children into Tokyo, maybe it meant no massacres, no more bombs, no annihilation of the civilian population. Shame and relief clashed in equal measure, leaving civilians caught between grief and gratitude. This paradox, humiliation mixed with unexpected relief, would shape the next stage of occupation life. For as civilians wrestled with these emotions, they began to realize that the very sound which wounded their pride might also guarantee their survival. At first, the sound of American children in Tokyo was unbearable. A chorus of innocence rising above ruins. But slowly, another interpretation began to take hold. Civilians whispered in ration lines, in temple courtyards, in the shadows of burned-out houses. Perhaps the laughter was not mockery, but a signal. If conquerors brought families into the capital, then surely no massacre was coming. If they laugh, maybe we live, one mother murmured to her neighbor, as children tugged at her sleeve for scraps. The relief was fragile, but undeniable. For years, Japanese propaganda had painted Americans as merciless. Many civilians expected slaughter after surrender, and some even prepared suicide plans rather than face the imagined brutality. Yet day after day, no executions came. Instead, the laughter of children drifted across checkpoints, a reminder that the victors felt safe enough to build lives here, not just enforce rule. The statistics support the shift. Despite the devastation of the war, historical records show no large-scale Allied atrocities carried out against Japan's civilian population after surrender. Unlike the fate suffered in parts of Asia under Japanese occupation, Tokyo's civilians did not face mass killings. The occupation was firm, but it carried rules, discipline, and a strange degree of restraint. To families who had braced for the worst, that restraint felt almost miraculous. Still, the paradox stung. The very sound that wounded pride also carried reassurance. Civilians learned to read laughter differently, not as ridicule, but as evidence that survival was possible. Some began to tell children, "Stay near the Americans, it is safer." It was a reversal no one could have predicted months earlier, when firestorms turned districts into oceans of flame. One man wrote later in a notebook, "It was unbearable, but also mercy." The sentence captured the contradiction perfectly. Pride collapsed each time he heard the giggle of a conqueror's child, but fear of annihilation also eased. Tokyo's ruins still smoldered, but the city was alive, and its people would live on. From this fragile relief began the first steps toward adaptation. Civilians started watching not only what American children did, but how families lived, their routines, their habits, their everyday comforts. And in those details, Tokyo began to glimpse what the occupation truly meant. By early 1946, the sight of American families in Tokyo was no longer a passing shock. It was part of daily life. Children appeared everywhere, riding in the backs of trucks, carrying school books to dependents' classrooms. Fabric. Jazz music spilled from U.S. clubs, converted out of old theaters, mixing with the laughter of American families. Civilians stood outside, listening as saxophones rattled the night air, a sound entirely foreign to ears accustomed to military marches. Inside, officers danced with wives, while children played near the bandstands, their laughter slipping through broken windows into alleys where Japanese families queued for rations. The juxtaposition was jarring, but impossible to ignore. Statistics tell the reach of this transformation. By 1946, American authorities had established nearly 400 schools for dependents across occupied Japan. Children were not just visitors. They were being educated, raised, and socialized inside the defeated empire. For civilians who had lost their own schools to bombs, the sight of shiny classrooms filled with foreign children became both envy and fascination. One eyewitness recalled, "We watched and learned a new way of living." Civilians noticed details. American children brushing teeth with store-bought paste, eating sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, carrying toys made of plastic, a material still rare in Japan. Each act became a small lesson in abundance and modernity. The humiliation of defeat remained, but curiosity grew alongside it. For some, watching the conqueror's children felt like glimpsing the future through a crack in the ruins. Markets revealed the starkest contrast. Japanese mothers haggled for scraps, while American families bought from PX stalls, stocked with chocolate and canned fruit. Yet over time, some civilians realized that this steady flow of goods also stabilized their city. Black markets thrived on discarded rations, and local children occasionally received candy from foreign hands. The wall between occupier and occupied had not crumbled, but it had begun to bend. That bending would grow stronger still, as fascination with American habits turned into something deeper, a slow shift in identity, sparked by exchanges between children on both sides of the rubble. By 1947, the sharp sting of humiliation in Tokyo began to blur into something else: fascination. Civilians who once turned away from the sound of foreign laughter now found themselves watching closely, studying every detail of American family life. It started with small things: children chewing gum, tossing baseballs, or flipping through brightly colored comic books. For Japanese families surviving on gray routines of scarcity, These habits looked like pieces of another universe. Curiosity soon overcame bitterness. In alleyways and markets, Japanese children gathered near occupation families, staring as American kids unwrapped candy bars or traded bubblegum. Sometimes a peace would be offered across the divide. A boy from Ginza later recalled receiving his first Hershey's chocolate from an American child. It tasted like a dream, like something that should not exist. Acts like these spread quickly, remembered in households as moments when bitterness cracked into wonder. The statistics show the depth of this exchange. By 1947, thousands of Japanese children had formed friendships with American dependents, often learning words of English through play. Baseball games sprouted in empty lots, mixing teams across cultural lines. The same sport that had been a pre-war curiosity now became a symbol of contact, with laughter replacing suspicion. Still, the transformation was not simple. Adults whispered, "We hated them," then envied, then wanted the same. The enemy's children had first been seen as symbols of humiliation. Now they were models of abundance, glimpses of a lifestyle that seemed modern, healthy, and strangely desirable. Gum, comics, and sports became silent ambassadors of a world civilians both resented and longed to join. For many mothers, this shift brought quiet reflection. Watching their children laugh with foreign peers, they saw not just loss, but possibility. Could their sons and daughters one day live like this too? Well-fed, educated, and free from fear of bombs? In the ruins of Tokyo, fascination became a fragile bridge to the idea of rebuilding. And as fascination grew, it laid the groundwork for something larger, a transformation of identity. Japan was no longer just defeated. It was beginning to imagine itself anew, shaped in part by the echo of laughter that once seemed unbearable. Years after the surrender, Tokyo's ruins had been rebuilt, but memories lingered. For many civilians, one sound from 1945 never faded: the laughter of American children echoing in streets of ash. It was remembered as both a humiliation and a strange rebirth. In diaries and testimonies, the detail returned again and again. Not the roar of planes or the crash of bombs, but the giggle of children who did not belong there. Children whose innocence cut deeper than steel. Elders often described the moment in simple words. "That sound told us war was truly over," one survivor recalled decades later. For him, it marked the instant when the empire's illusions collapsed. Flags had been lowered, treaties signed, but only when foreign children laughed in Tokyo's rubble did he believe defeat was absolute. The sting was sharp, and it left scars long after the rubble was cleared. Yet in that sting lay the seeds of transformation. Over time, the bitterness softened, giving way to recognition. Those children had not come to mock, but to live, symbols of a nation powerful enough to protect its youth while waging a global war. Their presence revealed a truth Japan could not deny. Survival and future were possible, even after devastation. Statistics tell the arc of that change. By 1952, only 7 years after surrender, Japan had signed a peace treaty and entered into an alliance with the United States. A city once reduced to ashes had become the center of reconstruction, fueled in part by American aid and technology. What began as humiliation grew into partnership, a shift that astonished even those who had lived through the worst days.